In Devolving English Literature, Robert Crawford uses the idea of provincialism to locate MacDiarmid alongside Eliot and Pound as provincial modernists who operated from the peripheries of metropolitan cultural centres. Indeed, the peripherality of Wolsey, where MacDiarmid composed much of the material that would go on to be published in 1955 under the title In Memoriam James Joyce, is especially marked in the sense that it is peripheral even to the Shetland mainland. In this paper, I offer some examples of how this geographical and cultural peripherality are reflected in a formal peripherality that I identify within what I term MacDiarmid's citation of poetics, his practice of selecting extracts from pre-existing texts before editing those extracts and then combining them together in his own work. In order to make this argument, I'm first going to propose a way to read MacDiarmid that emphasises both the source materials he chose to incorporate into his work and the way he edited and combined those materials. This approach considers how the meanings created through those techniques reinforce and contradict the meanings that can be identified through more conventional close reading of what I refer to as the surface text, that is, the words on the page considered independently to the sources from which they were taken. This way of reading MacDiarmid might seem to require some justification. We now have access to massive searchable databases of published texts, such as Google Books and the Times Literary Supplement Historical Archive, which allow us to find many of MacDiarmid's sources with relative ease, and even to imagine automated search projects that would work through the complete poems, available as an electronic text via ProQuest's Literature Online, and query each line in every available database. Yet neither MacDiarmid himself nor any of In Memoriam's readers on the text's first publication in 1955, or indeed at least until 2004 when Google Books was launched, would have had access to any of this information. A thorough examination of this idea is beyond the scope of this paper. However, I'm basing my analysis of In Memoriam on two ideas that can be substantiated with reference to the text. Firstly, both the form and the content of the text itself invites the sort of reading that I'm proposing here. And secondly, the different readers, that different readers would be expected to be aware of differing subsets of In Memoriam source materials. Both of these ideas are present in this extract from the first section of the text. Bruitist here refers to the musical philosophy of Bruitism, described in the 1913 Futurist manifesto, The Art of Noises, as the incorporation into musical works of sounds traditionally thought to be non-musical, such as sounds generated by machinery. And simultaneist refers to simultaneism, a kind of literary cubism developed in the 1910s as an attempt to present multiple viewpoints at the same time. This passage is suggestive, of course, of the way in which In Memoriam has been composed from its source materials, but the reference to simultaneism also illustrates a key implication of the text's citation of poetics. Certainly no individual reader would have as complete a knowledge of In Memoriam sources as is now available, and any attempt to specify which sources any individual reader would be aware of would inevitably be largely speculative. But this means that the text's literary cubism is not only a factor in its composition, it's also present in the reception of the work, with the text's different readers each bringing their own distinct viewpoints to the text as determined by their distinct individual knowledge of its source materials. And this idea can be used to reframe modern database-driven readings from being in some way artificial and distanced from the readings MacDiarmid might have expected, towards an imagining of the communal readings that might emerge if the text had a sufficiently large readership that had pooled its fragmented knowledge of In Memoriam source materials, an idea that resonates with the community of insight described in the text dedication. The idea of centre and periphery is alluded to explicitly in Memoriam in a way that evokes the allusions the text makes to its citation of poetics, and also provides an interesting example of those poetics. Around 2/3 of the way through the first section of the text, the speaker contends that we are no further from the centre of things, no farther from the great warm heart of humanity, or the general good, no less central to human destiny, when alone with a work of scholarship that can only appeal to perhaps one person per million. This passage is especially interesting in the context of the difficulties involved in determining whether an individual reader of In Memoriam would identify a specific source that MacDiarmid had incorporated within the text. In this instance, we can assume that many readers would be familiar with the stanza's origins, and in fact, in these specific circumstances, because of Fiona's paper earlier, I think you're all familiar with stanza's origins, as MacDiarmid's source here is, at least in the first instance, the first stanza of his poem in the Shetland Islands, which he had published in the author's note to the Islands of Scotland in 1939. We might imagine the experience of a reader then who encounters this passage in Memoriam for the first time, recognises it, and then takes a copy of the Islands of Scotland down from the shelf to compare the two texts side by side, a process that shares interesting similarities with how a reader might use a glossary of Scots words when reading the Scots lyrics or A Drunk Man Looks at the Thistle. The most extensive changes made during the incorporation of this material within Memoriam occur in the passage's first 5 lines, which we've got on the right there, which map onto the first 6 lines within the Shetland Islands, which are on the left, as it appears in the Islands of Scotland. In both the 1939 text and the 1955 text, the speaker appears to rebut the idea that they are cut off from something that is in some sense central, or at least centred. Indeed, both texts locate themselves on some sort of periphery and then speak from that periphery in order to call into question the abstract idea of the centre by referring to it through a series of cliches that are marked out as such through the use of quotation marks. The centre of things, the great warm heart of humanity, the general good, and central to human destiny. But the process through which the speaker is cut off from this central or centred thing differs between the two texts. The next point, I think, resonates with a question that was in the Q&A there and that arose following Alex Linklater's talk at the start. The speaker has firstly transformed from the lyric or quasi-lyric I am present in the 1939 text into a diffused communal we are in the 1955 text. And this change is concomitant with the elimination of the idea of physical geographical location. This effect is achieved through the deletion of the second line in the 1939 text and the editing of the last 2 lines. We lose the reference to the speaker being in the Shetlands and being absent from the metropolitan centres of London, New York, and Tokyo, but we also lose the idea of the speaker being in any physical location, as the image of the speaker sitting alone here, and also now implied by the I am of the first line, is replaced with the abstract when alone with a work of scholarship. Indeed, the speaker in Memoriam is never identified as being present in a physical location. As readers, all we know is that the text intends to transport us to the Airnac or solitary place of union that the speaker welcomed Joyce to a few hundred lines into the poem, where its description as our Airnac suggests that it is already populated with multiple voices. The physical peripherality evoked in the 1939 text certainly implies an intellectual peripherality, but the way in which the text is transformed to arrive at the 1955 text removes the physical origins of this peripherality so that only the intellectual peripherality remains. The point of comparison for the speaker's position, though, is the same in both texts. Anonymous and anonymising crowds and queues, and the spectator at Twickenham or Murrayfield at Ibrox. There's an interesting suggestion here, I think, of Glasgow 1960, the poem that MacDiarmid had published in 1935. But this reduces the individual to a unit, adrift in a modern mass culture represented by a selection of today's newspapers. Those newspapers are then themselves counterpointed by the introduction into the text of a catalogue of academic titles and their authors. In the 1939 text, then, the speaker's physical isolation is contrasted with the absence of physical isolation when in a crowd in an urban centre, whereas in the 1955 text, it is the speaker's intellectual isolation that is contrasted with the subjective experience of being an individual within such a crowd. In Memoriam, the geographical peripherality of Wolsey evolves into a sense of peripherality that is found within the text itself. This idea of textual peripherality and of challenging and potentially inverting the centre-periphery opposition can also be identified in the opening pages of the second section of In Memoriam, the world of words. The third stanza of this section, which is in the slide there, or the start of it, is 220 lines long and is largely constituted of a catalogue of author title pairs. This catalogue is an extended version of the technique that MacDiarmid had used in the second half of the Centre of Things stanza, in which he uses throughout In Memoriam in order to introduce a multiplicity of thematically connected ideas that are often expressed tersely and which run into and crowd in upon each other. In 1956, Edwin Morgan, the best early critic of In Memoriam, compared these catalogues with the quasi-academic bibliographies in Finnegan's wake, arguing that unlike Joyce, MacDiarmid didn't recognise the cumulative comic effect created by this technique. However, in 1982, Morgan revisited his evaluation and concluded that MacDiarmid was more aware of the comic potential of such lists than he had previously been taken to be. An analysis of the opening lines of The World of Words supports Morgan's later evaluation and identifies a comically playful impulse that is present in both the surface text and also in the way in which In Memoriam selects, transforms, and combines its source materials, and which contributes to the way in which the text complicates the idea of textual peripherality. The long catalogue stanza retains the diffused communal speaker used elsewhere in Memoriam and has them initiate the catalogue with a statement that misdirects readerly expectations. We have, of course, studied thoroughly Alsbach, English, and the others who have written on psychological response to unknown proper names. In the previous section of the text, the speaker engages with ideas relating to constructed languages such as Basic English, Occidental, Interlingua, and Novial, and sets the challenge of constructing a new language that maintains a cultural neutrality by drawing on the entirety of the vast international vocabulary. Taken in isolation, on a first reading, the meaning of Alsbach is not clear. However, when placed next to English, it becomes a name for one of these constructed languages, potentially a play on all speak. But the second half of the line undermines this reading with the phrase "who have written," recontextualizing Alsbach and English. And these are not, in fact, languages, constructed or otherwise, but are the names of authors. And these authors are cited as having written on psychological response to unknown proper names. That is precisely the phenomenon experienced by a reader when encountering the names Alsbach and English in this new context. This reveal uses the structure of a simple joke, a paraprostokion, where the reader has assumed a specific cultural frame for the first few words of the catalogue's opening lines, only to realise that this context was incorrect. This resonates, of course, with the humour that Morgan ends up identifying in the repetition of the catalogue structure, but it also alludes to the shifts in context that are playing out in the formal processes that are at work in the construction of the catalogue from its source materials. The vast majority of the long second stanza of The World of Words is taken from a single source. The American psychologist June Downey's 1929 book, Creative Imagination, Studies in the Psychology of Literature. But while Downey's text is the main source for this passage, the references to authors and titles that appear in Memoriam are taken from that text's footnotes. And while most of the author title pairs are presented without further reference to or description of the work in question, where the catalogue does incorporate material from the main text of Downey's work, it does so only having first cited the text of a corresponding footnote, thereby giving that footnote precedence. Overall, the effect here is that the centre and the periphery of the texts have been inverted, so that the context within which the reader encounters this material is suddenly changed in a way that evokes the surprising change of context that underpins the humour in the Alsbach English joke. One of the most surprising examples of the way in which In Memoriam recontextualizes peripheral source materials can be found in the passage that immediately precedes this catalogue. In the context of the constructed language the speaker proposed in the previous section of the text, the idea and word chart described in this stanza seems to suggest a technique or device that can facilitate the work of constructing this language, one that is related perhaps to the thinking graphics outlined in the previous section of the text, with which Patrick Geddes juggled words like algebraic terms to gain a clearness of idea impossible to get through prose exposition alone, in order to arrive at a description of living that included or could include every act and fact, dream and deed of all mankind on this planet. And clear parallels with what's going on in this quotation. However, MacDermid's source here is in fact an example of the advertising copy that the speaker of In Memoriam had described as a potential source for his simultaneist poems. The material is taken from a print advertisement presented in Memoriam, more or less in its original form, for a vocabulary aid, branded as an idea and word chart, which was produced and sold by the Psychology Publishing Company Limited of Marple, Cheshire. Rather than being some sort of Goethean tool intended to navigate the intricacies of MacDermid's proposed world language, the idea and word chart was in fact designed to encourage readers to pay the Psychology Publishing Company to send them a descriptive brochure. The nature of print advertising means that this source appeared in multiple issues of a number of different publications in the second half of the 1940s, including many publications that MacDermid is likely to have read. This makes it relatively difficult to determine precisely where MacDermid took this material from. And indeed, he may have encountered it on multiple occasions in different contexts before deciding to incorporate it within his own work. But this perhaps means that MacDermid's initial readership would have been relatively more likely to identify this source, having potentially seen it repeated in print in multiple publications on a weekly basis. This identification creates a striking effect, with peripheral paratextual material being centered in a way that invites a potentially knowing readership to read that material in new ways. Alan Riak has described, for example, how the tone and syntax of verse combine to effect a spontaneity of announcement and affirmation. Read in this way, this stanza seems most similar to reflective lyric passages of In Memoriam, such as the hawthorn tree passage in the first section of the text, the harebell passage in the snares of Varuna, and the realm of music passage at the start of Plaited Like the Generations of Men. But while each of these cases involves the transformation of prose into verse, they're all derived from descriptive, linguistically rich prose sources: a novel, a newspaper article about visiting the English countryside, and a letter from a musician to his wife describing a transcendent realm of music. Here, In Memoriam demonstrates that the same effect can be achieved with supposedly utilitarian material like advertising copy, once it is decontextualized and recentered. And it does so in a humorous way, with the forceful change of context that underpins the construction of this stanza, prefiguring the Ausbach English joke that immediately follows. In this paper, I've demonstrated how In Memoriam James Joyce can be read by considering the source materials that MacDermid used in its composition, and how those source materials were brought together to create the text that was published in 1955. As I have argued, approaching In Memoriam in this way and undertaking this approach alongside more traditional readings of its surface text highlights a formal peripherality that mirrors cultural and geographical peripherality within which MacDermid composed the text, and which is both highly experimental and playfully comic. But perhaps the more important point here is the value of the reading strategy itself, facilitated by the ease with which we can now locate many of MacDermid's sources. As Patrick Crotty has recently discovered, the Continental Sonnets, published in the Scottish Chapbook under the name C.M. Grieve in 1922 and 1923, were each sourced from material that had appeared in the Times Literary Supplement between September 1921 and November 1922. The TLS is by far the most common source in Memoriam, which suggests that we might think of the massive citational work that MacDermid undertook following his relocation to Wolsey as a return to or continuation of Grieve's pre-MacDermid work, rather than as an inferior deviation from the Scots work of the 1920s. Thanks very much.